You were never meant to be remembered." The words had been spoken without cruelty, without hesitation, as if they were nothing more than a fact written into the cold order of the world. And Eliza Whitmore had stood still when she heard them, her gloved fingers tightening around the edge of the carriage seat as the last trace of her name was struck from the ledger, the ink still wet when the book was closed, sealing her fate more completely than any prison could have done. Because this was not punishment, it was erasure, and erasure required no witnesses, no mourning, no explanation, only silence, the kind that swallowed a person whole until even memory refused to hold their shape. And so the carriage rolled on through the empty miles of winter road, its wheels cutting through snow that stretched unbroken for what felt like forever, and no one inside spoke to her, not the driver, not the man seated across from her who had been instructed not to meet her eyes, not even the wind that rattled against the glass like a distant warning she could no longer understand, because something inside her had already begun to fade, not her body, not yet, but the fragile thread that tied her to the world, her sense of being seen, of being counted, of being real, and she tried to hold on to it the only way she could, by whispering her own name beneath her breath. Eliza, so quietly it barely formed in the air, as if speaking it too loudly might shatter what little remained, but even that felt uncertain now, as though the name belonged to someone else, someone who had existed before this night, before the order was given, before she became nothing. And when the carriage finally slowed, the silence deepened rather than broke, the door opening to a stretch of land so vast and pale it looked untouched by time itself. No houses, no roads, no sign that anyone had ever belonged there. And for a moment she did not move, not out of fear, but because there was nowhere to go that would prove she still existed, nowhere to run that would return her name. And yet she stepped down anyway, her boots sinking inches into the snow, the cold rising through her bones with a quiet insistence, the carriage already beginning to turn away behind her as if she had never been part of its journey at all. And she stood there, alone in a silence so complete it felt almost sacred, as though the world itself had agreed to forget her, and she might have remained there, might have allowed herself to disappear exactly as intended, if not for the distant sound of another set of wheels approaching, slow, deliberate, cutting through the stillness with a presence that did not belong to oblivion. And when it stopped, when the door opened and a tall figure stepped down onto the frozen ground, he did not look away, did not hesitate, did not pretend not to see her. Duke Alexander Blackwood simply stood there, his dark coat unmoving in the wind, his gaze fixed on her, as if she were something undeniable, something that refused to vanish no matter how the world demanded it. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, before any question could be asked, something shifted, not in the world, but in the fragile space between being forgotten and being found. The wind did not soften for him, and yet he stood as though it answered to him alone, his presence cutting through the vast emptiness with a quiet authority that did not need to be declared. And Eliza felt it before she understood it, the strange and unfamiliar sensation of being seen, not as a shadow, not as a burden to be erased, but as something that occupied space in his world whether he allowed it or not. And that realization unsettled her more than the cold, more than the silence, more than the knowledge that she had been abandoned without a trace, because being unseen was easier. It required nothing, it demanded no response. But this man, this Duke, was waiting, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, as though he expected her to exist in return, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The distance between them no more than 10 feet, and yet filled with everything that had been taken from her and everything he had not yet decided to give, until at last he spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying no urgency and yet impossible to ignore. "You should not be here." And the words might have sounded like dismissal from any other man, but there was no dismissal in his tone, only a quiet recognition that something was wrong, something that did not fit the order of things he understood. And Eliza drew in a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her voice fragile not from weakness but from disuse. "I was told not to be anywhere," she said, and the honesty of it seemed to shift something in the air between them, subtle but undeniable, because it was not a plea, not a demand, only a statement of fact. And for the first time his gaze sharpened, not with suspicion, but with attention, as though he were examining a truth that did not align with the world he knew. And behind him the carriage driver shifted, waiting for instruction, waiting for the Duke to dismiss the inconvenience and continue on his way, because that was what men like him did. They did not stop for things that had already been discarded. They did not involve themselves in stories that had been intentionally ended. And yet Alexander Blackwood did not turn away, did not gesture for the carriage, did not release her back into the silence she had come from. Instead, he took a single step closer, measured, deliberate, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound that broke the stillness. And Eliza felt it again, that impossible awareness that she was still present, still accounted for in the space he occupied. And it made something inside her tighten, not with hope, because hope required belief, but with something quieter, more dangerous, the faint possibility that her existence had not been entirely erased. Who gave the order? He asked, and the question was simple, almost casual, but it carried weight, because it assumed there had been an order at all. And Eliza lowered her gaze for a moment, not in submission, but because the answer felt heavier than her voice could carry. It does not matter, she said softly. They made sure it would not. And for a brief second the wind seemed to still around them, as if even the world paused to consider what had been done. And when she looked up again, expecting indifference, expecting dismissal, she found something else entirely in his expression, not pity, never that, but a quiet refusal, as though the idea of her not matching was something he could not accept. And without another word, he turned slightly toward the carriage, his voice cutting cleanly through the cold air. Prepare a place for her. And the driver hesitated, just enough to reveal that this was not a common command, that this was not something the Duke did. But hesitation did not last in the presence of a man like Alexander Blackwood, and within seconds the carriage door was opened once more, not as a passage into oblivion, but as an invitation she had not been meant to receive. And Eliza stood there for a moment longer, her breath shallow, her thoughts unsteady, because she did not understand this turn, did not trust it. And yet she stepped forward, not because she believed she belonged, but because for the first time since her name had been erased, someone had refused to let her disappear. The carriage door closed behind her with a muted sound that felt far louder than it should have, as if it marked the boundary between two versions of the same life, one that had already been erased and one that had not yet been defined. And Eliza remained still for a moment inside the dim interior, her gloved hands resting in her lap as she adjusted to the unfamiliar sensation of movement that did not lead to disappearance. Because only minutes ago, every mile had carried her further from existence, and now each turn of the wheels seemed to do the opposite, though she did not yet understand how or why. And across from her, Duke Alexander Blackwood took his seat without looking away, his posture composed, his presence filling the narrow space with a quiet intensity that made the air feel heavier, not oppressive, but undeniable, as if there was no room left for anything false between them. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was watchful, deliberate, as though he were allowing her time to decide whether she would remain invisible or step into the space he had opened. And she could feel that choice pressing against her, unfamiliar and unsettling, because no one had asked her to choose anything in a very long time. You may speak if you wish, he said at last, his voice low and steady, not a command, not even an expectation, only an acknowledgement that she had a voice at all. And the simplicity of it caught her off guard more than any question could have, because it implied something she had already begun to doubt, that her words still held weight, that they could still exist in the world without being dismissed. And she hesitated, not out of fear, but because forming a thought that mattered felt like reaching for something she had almost forgotten how to hold. I do not know what I am supposed to say, she admitted quietly, her gaze lowering to the faint reflection in the carriage window where her face looked unfamiliar even to herself. And for a moment the Duke did not respond, his silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, as though he were considering not her answer, but the truth behind it. And when he spoke again, there was something different beneath his tone, something quieter, almost reflective. You are not required to be anything at all, he said, and the words settled between them with a weight that did not crush, but steadied, because they contradicted everything that had been done to her, everything that had defined her absence, and Eliza felt a subtle shift within herself, not a restoration, not yet, but the faint outline of something that had not been completely lost. And the carriage continued forward through the long stretch of winter road, the outside world fading into darkness as the sky deepened, and still he watched her, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with a focus that suggested he was trying to understand something beyond her appearance, beyond her situation, something that had nothing to do with the order that had erased her, and everything to do with the fact that she remained. And she found herself meeting his gaze for the first time without looking away, not out of confidence, but because there was no longer a reason to hide from someone who had already seen her. And in that quiet exchange, without declaration, without explanation, a fragile tension formed, not between two strangers, but between what had been decided for her and what he had chosen. Instead, and as the distant outline of his estate finally appeared through the dark, rising against the horizon like a structure carved from shadow and stone, Eliza realized with a slow, steady awareness that whatever awaited her there would not be simple, would not be safe in the way disappearance had been, but it would be real, undeniably real, and for the first time since her name had been taken from her, she was not certain she wanted to vanish anymore. The carriage slowed as it passed through iron gates that opened without question, as if the estate itself recognized its master and allowed no delay. And Eliza felt the shift before she saw it, the change from endless, indifferent wilderness to something structured, controlled, deliberate, where every stone and shadow had been placed with intention. And when the carriage finally came to a stop beneath the towering facade of Blackwood Hall, she remained seated for a moment longer, her hands still folded in her lap, as though stepping out would confirm something she was not yet ready to accept. Because this place was not meant for someone who had been erased. It stood too solid, too certain of its existence. And yet the door opened, and the cold night air slipped inside, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and stone, grounding and real. And when Duke Alexander Blackwood stepped down first, he did not look back immediately. He did not offer assistance as a gesture of formality. Instead, he paused just long enough to ensure she would follow of her own accord, as if even now he refused to force anything upon her that had already been taken. And after a brief hesitation, Eliza rose, her boots meeting the stone steps with a quiet sound that seemed to echo more than it should have, as though the house itself had noticed her arrival. And that thought unsettled her, because places like this did not notice people like her. They absorbed them, hid them, forgot them. But as she crossed the threshold, something else happened, something subtle but undeniable. The staff waiting inside straightened, their attention shifting not only to the Duke, but to her, not openly, not rudely, but enough that she could feel it, enough to remind her that she was visible here in a way she had not been before, and it made her instinctively still, uncertain of how to occupy that space, uncertain of what was expected of her now that she had not been dismissed. "She will be staying," the Duke said simply, his voice carrying across the grand entrance hall with a calm authority that allowed no room for question. And the words settled into the space like a decision already made, already accepted, though Eliza could feel the faint ripple they caused, the unspoken curiosity, the quiet confusion, because nothing about her presence fit the usual order of things, and yet no one challenged it, no one asked. And within moments a woman stepped forward, composed and efficient, her gaze respectful but observant. "We will prepare a room, Your Grace," she said, inclining her head slightly before turning to Eliza with a measured kindness that did not overstep. "This way." And Eliza followed, her steps soft against the polished floor, her attention caught by the details around her, the tall ceilings, the dim glow of candlelight reflecting off dark wood and stone, the quiet weight of a place that had stood long before her and would stand long after. And for the first time, she felt something she had not expected, not comfort, not yet, but a sense of being held within walls that did not immediately reject her. And as they moved further into the estate, away from the open hall, and into the more private corridors, the sounds softened, the world narrowing to the steady rhythm of footsteps and the distant crackle of fire somewhere deep within the house. And when they finally stopped at a door, the woman opened it with a gentle motion, revealing a room that was warm, carefully arranged, untouched by neglect or haste, as though it had been waiting rather than prepared. And Eliza paused at the threshold, her breath catching slightly, because nothing about this felt temporary. Nothing about it suggested she would be sent away by morning, and that realization stirred something unfamiliar within her, something fragile and uncertain. "You may rest," the woman said softly, stepping aside, and Eliza entered, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the door, as if confirming it was real, as if confirming she had crossed into a space where she was not immediately erased. And behind her, somewhere beyond the quiet corridors, the Duke remained, his decision already set into motion, though even he had not yet fully understood what he had chosen to keep from disappearing. Sleep did not come easily, not because the bed was unfamiliar, but because it was too soft, too still, too untouched by the kind of uncertainty she had grown used to. And Eliza lay beneath the heavy blankets with her eyes open, watching the faint glow of candlelight flicker across the ceiling as though it might vanish at any moment, as though everything around her existed on borrowed time, and she was no exception, because nothing in her life had ever shifted this quickly without consequence. Nothing had ever changed direction without demanding something in return, and yet here she was, in a room that held warmth without question, without condition, and that alone unsettled her more than the cold had ever done, because cold was honest. It did not pretend to offer more than it would give. But this place, this quiet, steady comfort, felt like something she had not been meant to receive, and her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the blanket as she whispered her name again. Softer this time. Eliza, testing it not for memory, but for truth, and it lingered in the air longer than before, not swallowed, not erased, and that alone made her close her eyes for a moment, not in peace, but in something close to disbelief. And beyond the walls of her room, the house continued in its quiet rhythm, distant footsteps, the low murmur of voices that did not rise into disturbance. The faint crackle of fire carried through the corridors like a steady heartbeat, and somewhere within that structure, the Duke remained awake, though he had long since withdrawn to his study. The door closed behind him as it always was, separating him from the rest of the world with a boundary he rarely allowed to be crossed. And yet tonight the silence within that room was not the same, because his thoughts did not settle into their usual order, did not return to the familiar patterns of responsibility and control. Instead, they lingered on something unexpected, something that did not belong to his carefully constructed distance. The image of a woman standing alone in the snow, not pleading, not reaching, simply existing in a way that defied the very act of being erased. And he found himself standing by the window, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse beyond the estate grounds, as though he might still see where she had come from, as though understanding that place might explain why he had not turned away, because he always turned away from inconvenience, from complication, from anything that threatened to disrupt the precision of his world. And yet he had not done so tonight, and that deviation did not sit easily within him, not because he regretted it, but because it had not been calculated, it had not been necessary, it had simply been chosen, and that was something far more difficult to ignore. And as the hours passed, he remained there, the quiet weight of the decision settling deeper with each moment, until at last he turned from the window, his steps measured as he moved through the corridor, not toward rest, but toward something else, something he had not intended when the night began. And he paused outside the door that had been prepared for her, his hand still at his side, his expression unchanged. And for a brief moment the silence between the door and his presence held a question he did not voice, a question of whether she would still be there, whether she would remain in the space he had offered. And though he did not knock, did not enter, he stood there long enough to feel the answer in the quiet stillness beyond. And when he finally turned away, returning to the shadows of the corridor, it was not with uncertainty, but with a growing awareness that whatever he had chosen to keep from disappearing was no longer something he could simply set aside. Morning did not arrive with brightness, but with a slow, muted gray that filtered through the tall windows as if the day itself were hesitant to disturb the quiet that had settled over the estate. And Eliza woke not with a start, but with a strange stillness, her eyes opening to a ceiling she did not recognize and yet had not vanished during the night. And for a moment she remained exactly where she was, her breath steady beneath the weight of the blankets, as though any movement might dissolve the fragile reality she had stepped into. But nothing shifted, nothing disappeared. The walls remained, the faint warmth in the air lingered, and the sound of distant footsteps moved through the corridor beyond her door, steady and real. And she slowly pushed herself upright, her fingers brushing against the fabric at her side, as if confirming once more that she occupied space, that she had not been returned to the emptiness she had come from. And when her feet touched the floor, the cool surface beneath them grounded her further, anchoring her in a place that did not reject her presence, though it did not yet fully welcome it either. And that balance unsettled her in a way she could not easily name, because she had been prepared to disappear, not to remain. And remaining required something she had not yet learned how to give. And after a moment she moved toward the window, her steps quiet, her reflection faint in the glass as she looked out over the vast stretch of land that surrounded the estate, the snow still unbroken in the distance, the horizon pale and endless, and somewhere beyond it lay the place where she had been left behind, though it already felt impossibly far away, not in distance, but in certainty, as if that version of her had already begun to fade, replaced by something uncertain but undeniably present. And a soft knock at the door drew her attention, subtle, respectful, not demanding entry but acknowledging her existence. And she hesitated only briefly before answering. Yes, her voice steady enough to surprise her. And when the door opened, the same woman from the night before entered with quiet composure, carrying a tray that released a faint warmth into the room, the scent of tea and fresh bread filling the air with something simple and grounding. "You should eat," she said gently, setting the tray down without expectation, without intrusion, as though she understood that this was not an act of service, but of recognition. And Eliza nodded, her hands still for a moment before she stepped closer, the reality of the gesture settling in slowly, because food offered without condition was something she had not experienced in a long time. And as she reached for the cup, the warmth seeped into her fingers, steady and real, and for a brief second she closed her eyes, not in gratitude, not yet, but in quiet acknowledgement of something she had not realized she needed. And beyond the room, the house continued its quiet rhythm, unaware or perhaps entirely aware of the shift that had taken place within its walls. And somewhere within that rhythm, the Duke moved through his morning as he always did, composed, precise, every action measured. And yet beneath that control something remained unsettled, not disruptive, but present, a quiet awareness that had not been there before. And when he paused at the end of the corridor, his gaze briefly drawn toward the closed door of her room, it was not curiosity that held him there, but something far more deliberate, the recognition that she had not disappeared during the night, that she had remained exactly where he had chosen to place her, and for reasons he had not yet fully defined, that mattered. The morning passed without disturbance, yet nothing within it felt ordinary, not to Eliza, not to the quiet rhythm of the house that seemed to observe her without intrusion. And as she finished the last sip of tea, she remained seated for a moment longer, her fingers loosely wrapped around the cup as if reluctant to release the small certainty it offered, because each simple thing in this place carried a weight she did not yet know how to carry. And when she finally stood, the room did not shift or disappear as it might have before. It remained unchanged, steady, waiting, and that waiting unsettled her more than absence ever had, because it required her to move forward rather than fade away. And after a brief hesitation she crossed to the door, her hand resting lightly against the handle as though testing whether she was permitted to leave, whether the space beyond would still acknowledge her presence. And when she opened it, the corridor stretched before her in quiet stillness, the soft glow of daylight filtering through tall windows along the far wall, illuminating polished floors and dark wood that seemed untouched by disorder. And for a moment she simply stood there, neither fully inside nor fully stepping out, caught between the instinct to remain unseen and the unfamiliar expectation that she no longer needed to hide. And then, with a steady breath, she stepped forward, her footsteps barely audible. As she moved along the corridor, her gaze drawn to the details around her, the framed portraits, the subtle patterns carved into the walls, each one a reminder that this place held history, permanence, identity, everything that had been stripped from her. And yet she was walking through it now, not as a shadow, but as someone who could be noticed, and that awareness made her straighten slightly, not with pride, but with a quiet resolve not to disappear within it. and as she turned a corner, the faint sound of voices reached her, low, measured, not meant for her ears but not concealed either, and she paused instinctively, not out of curiosity, but because she did not yet know where she was meant to belong within these walls. And before she could decide whether to retreat or continue, the voices fell silent, replaced by the distinct sound of footsteps approaching, steady, unhurried. And when Duke Alexander Blackwood came into view, the space seemed to shift subtly around him, not because he demanded it, but because everything aligned with his presence without resistance. And Eliza felt it again, that quiet awareness that she could not step aside fast enough to become invisible, because he would see her regardless. And so she did not move. She remained where she was, her hands at her sides, her posture still, meeting his gaze without lowering her eyes. And for a moment he said nothing, his attention resting on her with the same measured focus as before, as though confirming that she had not retreated, that she had chosen to step into the day rather than remain hidden from it. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried no surprise, no hesitation, only a calm acknowledgement. "You did not leave," and the words held no accusation, no assumption, only a simple recognition that she was still here, and Eliza felt the weight of that statement settle within her, because leaving had never been an option she could choose, not before, and yet now it felt like something else entirely, something that required intention, and she answered with the same quiet honesty she had offered before, "I did not know where to go," and something in her voice shifted the space between them. Once more, subtle but unmistakable, because it was not uncertainty she expressed, but truth. And for a brief moment the Duke regarded her in silence, as though measuring something beyond her words, something that had nothing to do with direction and everything to do with presence. And when he inclined his head slightly, it was not dismissal, but acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance that she remained not because she was lost, but because she had not been allowed to disappear. And in that moment, without announcement, without declaration, the distance between them changed, not erased, not closed, but altered in a way neither of them could ignore. The moment did not break, it deepened, as if the silence between them had found a new shape that neither of them rushed to disturb, and Eliza became aware of the space she occupied in a way she had not before, not as someone passing through unnoticed, but as someone standing within the direct attention of a man who had never learned to overlook anything that mattered. And that realization stirred something unsteady beneath her calm exterior, not fear, but the unfamiliar weight of being acknowledged without condition, and she held his gaze not out of defiance, but because there was no longer a reason to look away. And for a brief second it felt as though the world beyond that corridor had faded entirely, leaving only the quiet exchange between presence and recognition, until the Duke shifted slightly, not stepping closer, not retreating, but adjusting the balance of the moment with a subtle motion that restored the rhythm of the house around them. "This place does not require you to vanish," he said, his voice measured, each word placed with intention, and the statement carried no softness, no attempt to reassure, only a simple truth that did not ask for belief. And Eliza felt it settle within her differently than anything else had, because it was not an offer, it was a condition of the space she now occupied, and she lowered her gaze for just a moment, not in submission, but in thought, because understanding something did not mean she knew how to live within it. "I do not know how to remain," she admitted quietly, the words more difficult than they should have been, because they required her to acknowledge the absence of something she had never been allowed to develop. And when she looked up again, his expression had not changed, but something within his attention had, a deeper focus, as though her words had confirmed something he had already begun to recognize. And for a moment he did not respond, the silence stretching just enough to suggest that her uncertainty was not something he would dismiss or solve with simple instruction. And then he turned slightly, his gaze moving down the length of the corridor before returning to her. "Then you will learn," he said, and the certainty in his tone did not leave room for doubt, not because he demanded it, but because he had already decided it, and the simplicity of that decision unsettled her in a way she could not easily explain, because it was not imposed, it was not negotiated, it simply existed, and for the first time she felt the faintest shift in her own response, not resistance, but the beginning of something quieter, something that did not belong to survival alone. And as he moved past her, his steps steady, his presence no longer directly in front of her, but not diminished in any way, she felt the space he left behind not as emptiness, but as something altered, something that had been changed by the brief exchange they had shared. And she remained where she was for a moment longer, her thoughts unsteady but not scattered, her awareness sharpened by the realization that this place, this man, did not intend to let her fade into the background of his world, and that realization carried with it both uncertainty and something else she had not expected, a quiet, persistent awareness that she had been seen, fully and without question. And as she finally turned to follow the direction he had taken, her steps measured, her posture no longer hesitant, but not yet certain, she understood that whatever this place required of her would not be simple, would not be without challenge, but it would be something she had never been given before, the chance to remain, not by accident, but by choice, and somewhere ahead of her, just beyond the turn of the corridor, the Duke continued forward, already shaping a future that neither of them had planned, yet neither of them could now avoid. The corridor seemed longer as she followed in the direction he had taken, not because the distance had changed, but because each step carried a new awareness she had not known how to hold before, and Eliza moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of a quiet determination not to lose the fragile sense of presence she had begun to understand, and the house responded to her in subtle ways, not with welcome, not with resistance, but with a steady acknowledgement that she was moving through it, that she occupied space within walls that had not rejected her. And as she reached the end of the corridor, the sound of voices returned, clearer now, grounded in conversation rather than distant murmur, and she slowed instinctively, not to listen, but to steady herself, because stepping into a room where others already existed required something she had not yet mastered, the ability to remain visible without retreating into silence. And before she could decide whether to turn away or continue, the door ahead opened, and a man stepped out, pausing when he saw her, his expression shifting from routine focus to something more attentive, not suspicion, not dismissal, but a brief uncertainty that revealed she was not expected here, and Eliza felt it immediately, that subtle shift in balance, the moment where her presence could be questioned, where she might once have faded without effort, but she did not step back, she did not lower her gaze. Instead she remained where she was, her posture still, her breath steady. And after a moment the man inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than inquiry, and moved past her without comment, as though accepting what he did not yet understand, and the door remained open behind him, revealing a room lit by daylight and purpose, and within it stood the Duke, his attention briefly lifting from the papers before him as he became aware of her presence at the threshold. And for a second the space held that same quiet tension as before, not because she had intruded, but because she had chosen to remain instead of retreat, and he regarded her without surprise, without question, as though her arrival was simply the continuation of what had already begun, and Eliza felt something steady within herself as she stepped forward, crossing the threshold without hesitation, not because she belonged, but because she was no longer willing to disappear, and the room itself seemed to accept that decision. The light falling evenly across the space, the silence settling into a rhythm that did not exclude her. And when she came to a stop a few feet from his desk, she did not speak immediately, not out of uncertainty, but because words no longer felt like the only proof of her existence. And the Duke watched her for a moment, his gaze steady, measuring not her place, but her presence. And then he set aside the document in his hand, his attention shifting fully to her. "You chose to follow," he said, and there was no assumption in his tone, only recognition, and Eliza met his gaze. Without hesitation, her voice quiet but clear, "I chose not to remain behind." And the distinction between the two settled into the space between them, subtle but undeniable, because it was no longer about direction, it was about decision, and something in his expression changed, not visibly, not in a way that could be easily named, but in the quiet adjustment of understanding, as though he recognized that what stood before him was no longer someone waiting to be told where to stand, but someone beginning to define that space for herself. And in that moment, without declaration, without instruction, The balance between them shifted once more, not closing the distance, but reshaping it into something neither of them had anticipated, something that would not allow either of them to return to what had been before. The air in the study did not shift when she spoke, but something within it settled into a new form, quieter, more defined, as though the space itself had adjusted to include her without resistance. And Duke Alexander Blackwood remained still for a moment after her words, his gaze steady, not challenging, not yielding, but observing with a depth that did not allow for pretense. And Eliza felt that attention not as pressure, but as a constant, something that did not waver or turn away, and it anchored her in a way she had not expected, because for the first time her presence did not feel temporary, did not feel conditional. It simply existed within his awareness, and that alone altered the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she held herself in the quiet space between them. And when he finally moved, it was not abrupt, not dismissive, but deliberate, his hand resting briefly against the edge of the desk before he stepped around it, closing a small distance without urgency. And the motion was subtle, but it shifted the balance once more, bringing the moment out of observation and into something closer to intention. And Eliza did not retreat, did not lower her gaze. She remained where she was, her stillness no longer uncertain, but chosen, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was measured, as though both of them understood that whatever was spoken next would not be undone. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same controlled certainty, low, even, unmistakable. Then you will not be treated as someone who can disappear. And the words did not sound like a promise. They sounded like a decision, already set, already in motion, and Eliza felt them settle within her differently than anything else had, because they did not ask her to believe, they did not require her agreement, they simply redefined the space she now occupied, and for a brief moment, she did not respond. Not because she did not understand, but because understanding it required her to accept something she had never been allowed to claim. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but no longer fragile. That is not how the world sees me. And the truth of it hung between them, simple and undeniable, because the world had already made its decision, had already erased her without hesitation, and yet the Duke did not look away, did not soften, did not challenge her words with empty contradiction. Instead, he regarded her with that same steady focus, as though the world beyond these walls held no authority in this moment. And when he answered, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only clarity. The world does not decide what remains here. And the weight of that statement did not rise, it settled, grounding rather than overwhelming. And Eliza felt something shift again, not outwardly, not in a way that could be seen, but within the quiet space where her sense of self had begun to take shape once more. And it was not immediate, not complete, but it was undeniable. And she held his gaze as the meaning of his words unfolded, not as reassurance, but as a boundary, one that separated what had been taken from her from what he now refused to let be lost. And for a long moment neither of them moved, the silence holding steady around them, until the Duke turned slightly, his attention shifting not away from her, but toward the space beyond the study, as if acknowledging that what had been spoken did not end here, that it extended beyond this room, into every part of the estate she now occupied. And when he stepped back, it was not distance, it was continuation, a quiet signal that whatever had begun between them would not remain contained. And Eliza stood where she was for a moment longer, the weight of his words settling deeper with each breath, until she realized with a steady, growing certainty that she was no longer waiting to be told whether she existed. She was standing within a place where her presence had already been decided, and that decision could not be undone as easily as it had been before. The words did not fade when he stepped away. They remained, settling into the quiet structure of the room and following her even after the moment itself had passed. And Eliza stood there longer than she intended, her gaze unfocused as she tried to understand what it meant to exist within a decision that was not her own, and yet now defined her place more firmly than anything she had ever claimed for herself. And slowly, without urgency, she turned, her steps measured as she moved toward the open doorway, not retreating, not escaping, but continuing, because there was no longer a place for her to return to, no absence waiting to receive her. only the path forward that had been placed before her, and as she stepped back into the corridor, the light felt different, not brighter, not warmer, but more solid, as though it acknowledged her presence in a way it had not before, and the house moved around her with its quiet rhythm, servants passing with composed efficiency, their attention no longer lingering in uncertainty, but settling into acceptance, subtle, unspoken, but real, and Eliza noticed it in the smallest ways. The slight pause before a door was opened for her, the measured inclination of a head in, passing, not deference, not familiarity, but recognition, and each of those moments, brief as they were, reinforced something within her that had once been fragile and uncertain. And as she continued through the corridor, her steps no longer hesitant, she became aware of the shift not only in how others saw her, but in how she carried herself within the space. Not hidden, not shrinking, but present, undeniably so. And when she reached the far end of the hall, she paused briefly at a window, her reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time she did not look at it as though it belonged to someone else. She did not question whether it would vanish if she turned away. Instead, she held her own gaze for a moment, steady, quiet, as if confirming what had already begun to take shape, and beyond the glass the world stretched out in pale silence, unchanged, indifferent as it had always been. And yet it no longer felt like the only reality she could belong to, and that realization settled deeply, not as comfort, but as truth. And behind her, somewhere within the structure of the house, the Duke continued his day with the same precision he had always maintained, but the balance had shifted, subtle yet irreversible, because what he had chosen was no longer contained within a single decision. It had begun to alter the very rhythm of the place he controlled. And when his path crossed hers again later that afternoon, not by coincidence, but by design, the space between them no longer held the same distance, not because it had closed, but because it had been redefined, and he paused when he saw her, not in surprise, not in assessment, but in acknowledgement, as though her presence was now a constant within his world rather than an interruption. And Eliza met his gaze without hesitation, her posture steady, her expression composed. And for a moment nothing was said, because words were no longer necessary to confirm what had already been established. And when he inclined his head slightly, it was not instruction, not command, but recognition of something that had taken root beyond either of their expectations. And in that quiet exchange, without declaration, without promise, the path before them extended further than either had intended, no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what had refused to disappear. By late afternoon, the light across the estate had shifted into something softer, longer shadows stretching across the floors and walls as if time itself had slowed to observe what had taken root within those walls. And Eliza found herself drawn once more to the quiet spaces between rooms, not hiding, not wandering without purpose, but moving with a growing awareness that each step she took now belonged to her, that she was no longer passing through unnoticed, but existing within a place that had begun to accept her presence without question. And yet beneath that quiet acceptance something else stirred, something unresolved, something that could not remain unspoken forever. And as she paused near the entrance hall, her gaze briefly lifting toward the grand doors that had once marked the boundary between her existence and her disappearance, she felt the faint echo of what had been done to her, the deliberate act of erasure that still lingered beyond these walls, waiting, unresolved, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to consider it not as something final, but as something unfinished, and that thought alone shifted something within her, subtle but undeniable, because it required her to acknowledge that her story had not ended where others had intended it to, and as if drawn by that realization, she turned, her steps carrying her back through the corridors with quiet certainty until she reached the study once more, the door slightly ajar, the faint sound of paper and movement within confirming his presence, and she did not hesitate this time. She stepped forward and crossed the threshold without pause, her presence announced not by sound, but by intention, and the Duke looked up almost immediately, his attention settling on her with the same steady focus as before, though now there was no question in it, no need to assess or confirm, only recognition of someone who had chosen to stand before him again. And for a moment the silence held, not uncertain, but expectant, as though both of them understood that what would be spoken now would not be simple. And Eliza did not look away, her posture steady, her voice calm despite the weight of what she carried. "They intended for me to vanish completely," she said, and the words were not new. But the way she spoke them was, not as a statement of loss, but as a truth she was no longer willing to leave unchallenged, and the Duke did not interrupt, did not soften, his gaze remaining fixed on her as she continued. "If I remain here, if I exist as you have decided, then that does not end what was done." And the quiet intensity of her words settled into the space between them, not confrontational, not demanding, but clear, and for a moment he remained silent, his expression unchanged, though something deeper shifted within his attention, as though her words had brought into focus something he had not yet fully considered, not the act of saving her, but the consequence of allowing her to remain. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same measured certainty, though now there was something more beneath it, something that acknowledged the weight of what she had said. "No, it does not." And the simplicity of the answer did not diminish its meaning, it reinforced it. And Eliza felt a steady resolve settle within her, not born of anger, not driven by anything sharp or forceful, but by the quiet recognition that her existence here did not erase what had been done. It only ensured that it could not be forgotten. And the Duke stepped forward then, closing the distance between them with deliberate calm, his presence steady, unwavering. And when he spoke again, the words carried not just decision, but direction. "Then we will not allow it to remain unresolved." And the weight of that statement did not rise. It anchored, grounding the moment in something that extended beyond the walls of the estate, beyond the quiet safety she had been given, into a future that neither of them had planned, but neither of them would now turn away from. And Eliza held his gaze, her expression unchanged, though something within her had shifted irrevocably, because for the first time since her name had been erased, she was no longer simply existing within someone else's decision. She was standing within a choice that would carry consequences, not just for herself, but for the world that had once chosen to forget her. The words remained between them, not as an echo, but as a foundation, something that could not be undone once spoken. And Eliza felt their weight settle not on her shoulders, but beneath her feet, steadying rather than burdening, as though for the first time the ground beneath her existence would not give way without warning. And she held the Duke's gaze without hesitation, her silence no longer uncertain but deliberate, because there was nothing left to question in what had been decided, only what would follow. And outside the tall windows the fading light cast long shadows across the estate, stretching toward a horizon that no longer felt distant, but inevitable. And Alexander Blackwood did not step back, did not withdraw from what had been set into motion, his presence unwavering as he regarded her with a clarity that left no room for retreat, not for her, not for himself. Because this was no longer an act of intervention, it had become something else entirely, something that required continuation. And for a moment the quiet of the study held them in perfect stillness, as though the world itself had paused to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. Until at last Eliza spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying none of the fragility it once had. "Then I will not remain silent." And the words did not rise, did not challenge, they settled, firm and undeniable, and something in his expression changed, not visibly, but in the subtle alignment of purpose that followed, as though her choice had met his decision and transformed it into something shared, something that no longer belonged to one will alone. And he inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, not in permission, but in recognition. And when he turned, it was not to end the moment, but to move beyond it, his steps measured as he crossed toward the window, his gaze lifting to the darkening expanse beyond the estate grounds, as if already considering the distance between what had been done and what would now be answered. And Eliza remained where she was for only a moment longer before she followed, not because she was led, but because she chose to stand beside him rather than apart. And when she reached the window, the reflection that met her gaze no longer appeared uncertain or distant. It was steady, defined, no longer fading at the edges, and she did not look away. She did not question it. She accepted it as it was, because for the first time it had not been erased by the world beyond, and the silence that settled between them was no longer fragile. It was grounded, filled with the quiet certainty of something that had already begun to unfold, and beyond the glass the world remained unchanged, vast, and indifferent, unaware that what it had tried to erase had not only remained, but had found a place where it could no longer be ignored. And as the last light of day gave way to evening, Eliza felt the final trace of doubt dissolve, not into confidence, not into certainty, but into something quieter and far more enduring. The simple truth that she had not been forgotten, not by him, not by herself, and somewhere within that quiet realization lay the beginning of something that would reach far beyond these walls. Because some stories do not end when they are erased. They begin when someone refuses to let them disappear.